I've thought about this for years, how to tell it without sounding like I've gone off the deep end. But I can't shake it. The footage still sits in a drawer under my bed, a reminder of a time I can't explain. It was late April 2010 when it all started, a camping trip near the Cascades. Elvis was 4 years old then, just a boy who loved sticks and rivers and asking questions I didn't always know how to answer. We were supposed to be there for 3 days. He vanished on the first night. The police searched for 6 months. They dragged the river twice. We held a funeral with an empty casket, and then, 7 years later, the footage surfaced. Footage of my son, 11 years old, alive, covered in hair, walking beside a Bigfoot family like he'd been born into it. The researchers who tracked them down leaked it online before I even knew it existed. You probably won't believe me, but I swear it's true. It was the kind of small-town life where everybody knew everybody, even if you didn't want them to. I worked at the mill a few miles out of town, and Samantha, my wife, she'd work long shifts as a nurse at the county hospital, trying to keep up with the bills. Elvis was our only child. He was 4 that spring, 2010, when we decided to take him camping for the first time. The plan was simple. 3 days at Marble Creek, about 40 miles into the Cascades, right where the forest gets thick and the cell service cuts out. It was a place I'd camped as a kid, back when my father was still around. I wanted Elvis to have that. The smell of campfire smoke, the sound of the river, the kind of quiet you only get when you're far from roads and people. We packed the truck on a Friday afternoon. Samantha had the weekend off, a rare thing, and Elvis was bouncing around the driveway asking if bears lived in tents and whether fish could see in the dark. I remember laughing, telling him we'd find out together. That was the last normal conversation I had with my son. The drive up was beautiful. Spring rain had turned everything green, and the mountains were still capped with snow. Elvis sat in the back seat with his face pressed to the window, pointing at every deer and hawk we passed. Samantha held my hand across the console. We were happy. I need you to understand that. We were happy. We reached the campsite just before sunset. The river was high from snowmelt, rushing fast and loud over the rocks. I set up the tent while Samantha unpacked the cooler and Elvis collected sticks for the fire. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger. That night we roasted hot dogs and told stories. Elvis asked about Bigfoot. He'd seen something on TV, and I told him it was just a legend, something people made up to explain the woods. He seemed disappointed. Samantha laughed and said, maybe we'd see one anyway. I wish I'd kept my mouth shut. Elvis went to bed around 9, tucked into his sleeping bag between us in the tent. Samantha and I stayed up a little longer, sitting by the fire, talking about nothing important. Work, bills, whether we should get a dog. The river was loud, a constant white noise that made everything else feel distant. I remember checking on Elvis before we turned in. He was asleep, his face peaceful, one hand curled under his chin. I zipped the tent flap and told Samantha he'd sleep through the night, that the river sound would keep him out cold. That was mistake number 1. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The fire had died down to embers, and the tent was cold. I could hear the river, still rushing, and the wind moving through the trees. But something felt wrong. That kind of wrong you feel in your gut before your brain catches up. I reached over to check on Elvis. His sleeping bag was empty. I shook Samantha awake. She sat up fast, already reaching for the flashlight. He probably went to pee, she said, but her voice was tight. We both knew. 4-year-olds don't wander off alone at 3 in the morning, not in the woods, not near a river moving that fast. We got out of the tent and started calling his name. Our voices sounded small against the trees and the water. I swept the flashlight beam across the campsite, the fire pit, the cooler, the truck. No sign of him. Samantha started crying, asking where he could have gone, and I didn't have an answer. We split up. She stayed near the tent in case he came back, and I headed toward the river. The bank was steep and slick with mud. I kept thinking about how fast the water was moving, how cold it would be, how a small body could get swept downstream in seconds. I found his shoe. Just one, a little blue sneaker, half buried in the mud about 20 feet from where we'd set up camp. It was pointing toward the river. I stood there staring at it, the flashlight shaking in my hand, and I knew. I knew he'd gone into the water. I ran back to camp and told Samantha. She screamed, a sound I'd never heard from her before, raw and animal. We tried calling 911, but there was no signal. I told her to stay put, to keep calling his name, and I got in the truck and drove until I found a ranger station 15 miles down the mountain. The ranger, his name was Mills, he radioed it in immediately. Within 2 hours, the area was swarming with search and rescue teams. They brought dogs, boats, divers. They searched the river for 3 miles downstream, dragging nets through the water, checking every eddy and snag. They combed the forest in grid patterns, calling his name until their voices gave out. I spent those first 72 hours in a kind of fog. I walked the riverbank until my legs gave out. I answered the same questions over and over. What was he wearing? Did he know how to swim? Had we heard anything unusual? Samantha stopped eating. She just sat by the tent, staring at the trees, waiting for him to walk out of them. On the 4th day, they found his other shoe, half a mile downstream, caught in the branches of a fallen tree. The divers said the current was too strong, that if he'd gone in at night, in the dark, there was almost no chance. They didn't say the words, but I heard them anyway. They were looking for a body now, not a boy. The official search lasted 6 months. The first 2 weeks were intensive. Helicopters, thermal cameras, volunteers from 3 counties. After that, it slowed down. They'd check the river after storms, follow up on reported sightings that always turned out to be nothing. But I could see it in their eyes. They'd already decided. Elvis had drowned. The river had taken him. Samantha and I stayed in a motel near the campsite for the first month, refusing to leave. But eventually, we had to go home. We had to face the empty bedroom, the toys he'd never play with again, the future we'd planned that didn't exist anymore. They called off the search in October. The sheriff came to our house personally to tell us. He sat in our living room with his hat in his hands and said they'd done everything they could, but without a body, without any new evidence, there was nothing more to do. He said Elvis's case would stay open, that if anything turned up, they'd follow it. But I knew what that meant. It was over. Samantha wanted to hold a funeral. I didn't. How do you bury someone when there's nothing to bury? But she needed it. She needed to say goodbye, to have a place to go and grieve. So we did it. Late October, almost 6 months to the day after he'd vanished. We held a service at the Methodist church in town, and we buried an empty casket in the cemetery on the hill. I don't remember much about that day. I remember the rain, cold and steady, drumming on the umbrella. I remember Samantha's hand in mine, shaking. I remember people saying things. He's in a better place, God has a plan, and wanting to scream at them that there was no plan, no reason, just a river and a mistake and a boy who'd never come home. After the funeral, something in Samantha broke. She stopped talking about Elvis. She packed up his room, boxed everything, and put it in the attic. She went back to work and moved through her days like a ghost. We stopped touching. We stopped talking about anything that mattered. The marriage was over, even if we didn't say it out loud yet. I couldn't let it go the same way. I kept going back to Marble Creek, every weekend, sometimes more. I'd hike the trails, walk the riverbank, search the woods for something the professionals had missed. People thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that there was more to the story. And I was right. It was a researcher who found them, a man named Dr. David Keller, a primatologist from Oregon who'd spent 20 years tracking Bigfoot sightings in the Cascades. He had cameras set up in remote areas, monitoring game trails and water sources, looking for evidence most people said didn't exist. He'd been tracking a family group for 3 years. He called them the Marble Creek Clan, 2 adults and what he thought was a juvenile. He had thermal footage, audio recordings of vocalizations, even a few blurry photographs. But in the spring of 2017, 7 years after Elvis disappeared, he got something he wasn't expecting. A trail camera positioned near a creek tributary caught movement just after dawn. The footage showed the Bigfoot family, 2 massive adults covered in dark brown fur, walking upright through the forest. And with them, a child. Not a juvenile Bigfoot, a human child. Keller watched the footage dozens of times before he understood what he was seeing. The boy was around 11 years old, thin but muscular, moving on all fours as often as upright. His hair was long and matted, dark brown, hanging past his shoulders. His arms and chest were covered in fine hair, more than any child should have. And he was communicating, not with words, but with the same vocalizations the Bigfoot used. Low whoops, grunts, wood knocks made by striking sticks against trees. Keller tried to keep it quiet. He contacted the local sheriff's office, sent them the footage, and asked them to identify any missing children from the area. That's when my phone rang. I was at work when the sheriff called. He said there was something I needed to see, that I should come down to the station. I thought maybe they'd found remains. 7 years later, that's all I expected. But when he showed me the footage, when I saw that boy moving through the forest with the Bigfoot family, I knew. The way he tilted his head, the shape of his face, even under all that hair, that was Elvis. My son was alive. I watched that footage 20 times in the sheriff's office, pausing it, zooming in, trying to convince myself I was wrong. But I wasn't. The scar on his left knee from when he'd fallen off his tricycle. It was there. The way he moved his hands, when he was thinking, that was there too. 7 years older, transformed into something I barely recognized, but still my son. Samantha was at work. The sheriff called her, and she came down to the station still wearing her scrubs. When she saw the footage, she didn't cry. She just stared at the screen, her face blank, and said, "That's not possible." But she knew, just like I knew. The sheriff wanted to organize a recovery operation immediately. Find the Bigfoot family, tranquilize them if necessary, bring Elvis home. He was talking about helicopters and tracking teams and calling in wildlife experts. I remember sitting there listening to him and feeling this cold dread settle into my stomach. Because I'd seen the footage. I'd seen the way Elvis moved with them, the way he communicated, the way he looked at the larger Bigfoot, not with fear, but with trust, with something that looked like family. Dr. Keller had already leaked the footage. Not maliciously, he'd sent it to colleagues for verification, and someone had posted it online. Within 48 hours, it was everywhere. News outlets, YouTube, conspiracy forums. Missing child found living with Bigfoot family. Boy raised by Sasquatch for 7 years. The headlines were insane, sensational, but they weren't wrong. Our house was surrounded within a week. News vans parked on the street. Reporters knocked on the door at all hours. Researchers wanted interviews. Hunters wanted coordinates. Everyone had an opinion about what should be done, what we should do, how to save Elvis. But nobody asked the question I couldn't stop thinking about. What if he didn't want to be saved? What if bringing him back meant destroying the only life he remembered? The sheriff organized the operation anyway. 2 weeks after the footage surfaced, he assembled a team, wildlife experts, trackers, a veterinarian, armed deputies in case the Bigfoot became aggressive. Dr. Keller agreed to guide them to the area where he'd placed the cameras. The plan was simple: locate the family, tranquilize the adults if necessary, and retrieve Elvis. Samantha wanted to go. The sheriff said no. Too dangerous, too emotional, she fought him on it, but in the end, she stayed home. I went. I had to. Whatever happened, I needed to be there. We hiked into the backcountry for 6 hours, following coordinates and game trails. The forest was thick, old-growth cedar and Douglas fir, the kind of place that feels timeless. Dr. Keller moved quietly, checking for signs, broken branches, footprints, scat. He said the family had a range of about 30 square miles, that they moved seasonally following food sources. We found their camp just before sunset, a clearing near a creek sheltered by rock outcroppings. And there they were, 2 massive Bigfoot, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur. They were sitting near the water, and between them was Elvis. He'd grown, he was taller, leaner, but it was the hair that stopped me cold. His arms were covered in it, thick and dark. His chest had fine hair spreading across it. His own hair was matted into thick ropes that hung down his back. He was barefoot, wearing the tattered remains of pants that didn't fit anymore. And he was making sounds, low vocalizations, grunts and hoots that the Bigfoot answered. One of the deputies raised his tranquilizer rifle. I grabbed his arm and said, "Wait." Because Elvis wasn't afraid. He wasn't being held captive. He was sitting between them, leaning against the larger one, and he looked content. The Bigfoot saw us. Both adults stood, and the sound they made was like nothing I'd ever heard, a roar mixed with a scream, deep and resonant. Elvis scrambled behind them, and they moved to shield him. The larger Bigfoot, I assumed it was the one who'd pulled him from the river, stepped forward. The hair on its back was raised, its massive hands curled into fists. It was protecting him, the same way I would have. I stepped forward, away from the team, my hands raised. The sheriff hissed at me to get back, but I ignored him. I moved slowly, carefully, until I was about 20 feet from them, and I spoke. "Elvis, it's Dad. Do you remember me?" He peered out from behind the Bigfoot's leg. His eyes, they were still the same green eyes I remembered, but there was something different in them, something wild. He tilted his head the way he used to when he was trying to figure something out, and made a soft questioning sound. Not words, just sound. I tried again. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk." But even as I said it, I knew. He didn't understand me. 7 years with the Bigfoot, 7 years without English, and he'd forgotten. Or maybe he'd never really had enough language to remember. The smaller Bigfoot, a female I thought, placed a hand on his shoulder, a protective gesture, gentle. And Elvis looked up at her the way a child looks at a mother. That's when I understood. She hadn't stolen him. She'd saved him, pulled him from the river when he'd fallen in, kept him alive when he should have drowned. And in doing so, she'd become his mother. The larger Bigfoot made 3 sharp knocks with a stick against a tree. A warning. The team behind me shifted, and I heard the click of the tranquilizer rifle being readied. I turned and shouted, "Don't! Don't you dare!" Because what were we doing? Tearing a child away from the only family he knew to bring him back to a world he didn't remember? To parents who were strangers? To a life that would never make sense to him? The sheriff called my name, told me to step back. But I couldn't move. Elvis stepped out from behind the Bigfoot. He moved closer, cautious, the way you'd approach a wild animal. He stopped about 10 feet away and studied my face. I could see him trying to remember, searching for something familiar. And for just a moment, I thought I saw recognition, a flicker of something in his eyes. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo, the last one we'd taken before the camping trip. Elvis on my shoulders, grinning at the camera, Samantha beside us. He stared at it, his head tilting again. He reached out one hand, fingers covered in dirt and calluses, and touched the screen. He made a soft sound, almost sad. But then the larger Bigfoot called to him, a low vocalization, and Elvis turned away. He went back to them, slipping between the two adults, and they closed ranks around him. The message was clear. He was theirs. Dr. Keller stepped up beside me. "We can still do this," he said quietly. "We can bring him home." But I shook my head, because this was his home, the forest, the creek, the Bigfoot family that had raised him. We were the strangers. I told the sheriff to call it off. He argued with me, said I wasn't thinking clearly, that we had a legal obligation to retrieve the child. But I stood my ground. "He's not a child anymore," I said. "He's something else, and I won't let you drag him back to a world that'll never accept him." The team withdrew, slowly, carefully, backing away from the clearing. The Bigfoot watched us go, never moving, still shielding Elvis. And just before we disappeared into the trees, I looked back one last time. Elvis was standing between them, holding the female's hand. He was safe. He was loved. That was the last time I saw my son. The footage was already everywhere by the time we got back. Someone on the team had recorded the encounter on their phone, and it leaked within hours. The video showed everything: Elvis covered in hair, communicating with the Bigfoot, retreating behind them when we approached. The internet exploded. Everyone had an opinion. Scientists wanted to study him. Animal rights activists said he should be left alone. Religious groups called it a miracle or an abomination, depending on their bent. Hunters organized expeditions to track down the Bigfoot family. The governor's office issued a statement. It became an international story. Samantha watched the encounter footage alone in our bedroom. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying anymore. She looked at me and said, "You let him go." Not a question, an accusation. I tried to explain that he didn't know us, that he was happy, that bringing him back would destroy him. But she didn't want to hear it. She said I'd given up, that I'd abandoned our son a second time. She moved out 2 weeks later. The divorce was finalized within a year. I don't blame her. How could I? She'd spent 7 years believing he was dead, grieving, surviving that grief. And then to find out he was alive, but unreachable, that I'd chosen to leave him there, it was too much. Some things break people, and there's no putting them back together. The media circus lasted about 3 months. Then a new story took over the news cycle, and people moved on. The Forest Service closed the area to the public, trying to protect the Bigfoot family from hunters and researchers. Dr. Keller's footage was analyzed by every expert who could get their hands on it. Some called it proof of Bigfoot's existence. Others called it an elaborate hoax. I didn't comment. I didn't do interviews. I kept the one piece of footage I had, the clip the sheriff had shown me, the first one, and I locked it away. Years have passed now. It's 2024, and Elvis would be 18, an adult by human standards. I wonder what he looks like now, if the hair has covered more of his body, if he's grown taller. I wonder if he ever thinks about that day in the clearing, if he remembers my face or the photo I showed him. Dr. Keller still monitors the area. He sends me updates sometimes, emails with vague descriptions of sightings and thermal images. He saw the family again last year, 2 adults, 1 adolescent. He thinks it was them. He thinks Elvis is still alive, still with them. I want to believe him. I moved away from the Cascades, too, years after everything happened. Sold the house, packed what little I had left, and drove east. Started over in a place where nobody knew my name or my story. I work construction now, simple labor that keeps my hands busy and my mind quiet. I don't talk about what happened. When people ask if I have kids, I say no. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I pull out the footage. I watch Elvis moving through the forest, communicating with the Bigfoot, being part of something I'll never understand. And I wonder if I made the right choice, if letting him go was an act of love or cowardice. I think about the river, how he fell in, how the current took him, how he should have died. But something pulled him out. Something saved him when I couldn't. Maybe that's what I hold on to, that when it mattered most, when he needed someone, the Bigfoot were there. I still hear the knock sometimes. 3 deliberate strikes, wood on wood, echoing through the night. I tell myself it's just the house settling, just the wind. But part of me wonders if it's them. If somehow across all those miles, they're still out there, still watching. I got one more email from Dr. Keller last month. No explanation, just a video attachment. I almost deleted it. I'd spent years trying to move on, trying to build a life that didn't revolve around what I'd lost. But I opened it. The footage was recent, date stamped 3 weeks earlier. Early morning, fog rolling through the trees. And there they were, the Bigfoot family. But there were 4 of them now, the 2 adults I recognized. A younger one, tall and covered in hair, moving with that same careful grace. Elvis, and beside him, a small figure. A child? Human? Maybe 3 or 4 years old. I watched it 5 times before I understood. Elvis had found another one, or maybe the Bigfoot had. Another lost child, another rescue. And Elvis, now the older sibling, the teacher, was helping raise them. The cycle had continued. I don't know what to feel about that. Part of me wants to believe it's beautiful, that they're saving children who would otherwise die alone in the wilderness. But part of me wonders how many families are out there, searching, grieving, never knowing their child is alive. I haven't told anyone about the footage, not the sheriff, not Samantha, not the media. Some secrets are too big to share. Some truths would do more harm than good. If I came forward, there'd be another operation, another attempt to rescue children who might not want to be rescued, and I can't do that to them. So I keep it to myself. I watch the video sometimes, late at night, and I see my son teaching a younger child how to knock on trees, how to communicate. And I think maybe he's found his purpose. Maybe being raised by Bigfoot wasn't a tragedy. Maybe it was exactly what he needed to become, who he was meant to be. I'll never know for sure. But I choose to believe it. I can't explain it. I know how it sounds. A man who lost his son and couldn't let go, who convinced himself that abandonment was love. But I don't think they were trying to hurt him. I know they weren't. Elvis wasn't just lost. He was found by Bigfoot, saved by them, raised by them. Maybe it wasn't a mistake what happened. Maybe it was meant to be. Maybe there are some children who belong to the forest more than they belong to us. I don't know. I'll probably never know for certain. All I have is the memory of his smile, the one he had before he went into the woods. The way he used to laugh when I chased him around the yard, the way his hand felt in mine, small and warm and trusting. But I also have the memory of him in that clearing, standing between the Bigfoot, protected and safe, looking at me like I was a stranger. And maybe that's what I had become, a stranger, someone from a life he'd left behind. I still think about the river, how fast it was moving that night, how cold, how a 4-year-old had no chance of surviving on his own. But he didn't survive on his own. Something pulled him out. Something decided he was worth saving. And for 7 years, that something gave him a life I never could have. The knocking, it's still out there. And I hear it sometimes, even now, even 1,000 miles away from the Cascades. 3 knocks at 3 in the morning, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I get up, go to the window, and look out at the trees. There's never anything there, just shadows and moonlight and the memory of a boy who walked into the river and came out someone else. 3 knocks, always 3. A signal, a greeting, a reminder that somewhere out there in the deep places we've forgotten, Bigfoot is real and my son is with them. And maybe, just maybe, that's where he always belonged.